Hi guys, welcome to the fourth section, Reactive versus a Typical Event-Driven Approach. In this section, we start with handling error states in operator chains. We then move to concat and merge operators. Lastly, we see writing a reactive event dispatcher. Now, we move on to the first video of this section that deals with handling error states in operator chains. In this video, we're going to take a look at the retry operator and retryWhen operator. We will also see the catchError operator. We know that operator emits onError when it wasn't able to download any data. The question is, what if we want to try downloading the URL again? And even more interestingly, repeat the failed attempt every few seconds. Let's see an example for subscribing only to onError signals is simple with the second parameter to the subscribe callback method. It is obvious that nesting another CURLObservable into onError handler is probably not an option. This is exactly what the retry operator is designed for. When the retry operator receives an onError signal, it captures it and tries to resubscribe to its source observable. It takes as an argument the number of times it tries to resubscribe until it passes the error signal down the operator chain. Let's use the retry operator in the previous example. It tries to resubscribe to the CURLObservable 3 times until debug subject receives the onError signal. By default, the retry operator takes no parameters and tries to resubscribe infinitely. For this reason, we're better off using the map operator to trigger onError signals from now on. To our advantage, the map operator calls its callable wrapped inside a try-catch block, so any exception thrown will be turned into an onError signal. This code is supposed to print numbers from 1 to 6, but fails every time on number 3. As you can see, we have the val variable equals to 3. It will throw an exception error. Now, try to guess what happens before looking at the actual output. We run this command. It will print only the numbers 1 and 2 3 times and then ends with onError. Due to the fact that retry operator resubscribes to its source observable and emitting an onError signal always makes the chain stop propagating further values. When the map operator signals onError, it immediately resubscribed thanks to the retry operator, which in turn resubscribes to range observable and starts emitting values from the beginning. This marble diagram represents how the retry operator works. Now we see another code example. If we wanted to simulate a situation where we get numbers from 1 to 6 except number 3, we could make an external count variable and increment it, instead of relying on values coming from range observable. To stop emitting values, we use takeWhile function, which calls onCompleted when its callable returns false. We run this command. It prints the output. As you can see, the number 3 is not printed. OnCompleted is called at the end of the output. This one is another code example. We can make a simple test scenario that is closer to a real-world application. We will take our CURLObservable and try to repeat an HTTP request 3 times. We will choose any non-existing URL to be sure it fails every time to see how the error is propagated through the operator chain when using retry operator. We are using defer function here to show that the retry operator causes resubscription to the source observable, and this URL is a non-existing one. Run this command to get the output. This output is returned. We can see that it took 3 iterations before the error reached debug subject. Similar to retry operator, there is also an operator called retryWhen operator, which is in contrast to retry operator. This operator doesn't resubscribe immediately. Operator retryWhen takes as an argument a callable that returns another observable. This observable is then used when the onError signal occurs to schedule resubscription. We start with the retryWhen operator to show its functionality, which is a little more complicated. This callable to retryWhen operator takes an observable as an argument and has to return an observable. Here, you can see it is returning notification OBS. Then, when an error signal occurs, it's pushed to this variable as onNext, so we can decide, based on the type of error, what we want to do. Depending on the emissions from the return notification OBS variable, we can control what happens next. OnNext When notification OBS variable emits the onNext signal, The retryWhen operator resubscribes to its source observable. Note that the value emitted is not important. On error, the error is propagated further down the operator chain. On complete, the on complete signal is propagated further down the operator chain. Let's run the code. When CURLObservable fails, it emits the on error and the retryWhen operator waits 1 second and then resubscribes, which will make CURLObservable try to download the URL again indefinitely. Now we kill this process. Since the retryWhen operator is slightly more complicated, we look into its internals to understand why it works this way. It creates an instance of subject and stores its reference in variable called errors variables. Subjects work as both observables and observers. It needs to use subject because it is important to be able to manually trigger signals such as onNext, which is not possible with just an observable. When the operator calls its callable, it passes along the asObservable method and expects to receive an observable which is stored in another variable called when. The method asObservable wraps subject with an anonymous observable and thus hides that it is an instance of subject. This means that we have the head and tail of the chain of observables in variables errors and when variables respectively. Later on, when an on-error signal is received, the operator calls onNext method which sends the value through the chain of observables. In our case, it goes through the delay operator. Then, callbackObserver is subscribed to when variable, which can later resubscribe to the source observable of this operator. The operator doesn't care about onNext or onCompleted and passes them right into observer variable. The only signal it needs to handle is onError, which calls onNext method and therefore triggers the chain of observables, eventually resulting in resubscribing to the source observable inside the subscribe method callable. This technique of using an instance of subject to be able to manually trigger signals and at the same time subscribe observers to it is very useful. We're going to use it in a moment when we implement our event dispatcher. We can create the same example with the retryWhen operator while having more control if and when we want to retry the HTTP request. In this code snippet, we make 3 attempts where each is delayed by 1 second and then rethrow the exception, which is caught by the map operator and passed as an on-error signal. Since notification OBS variable sends the on-error signal, the retryWhen operator passes this error. We also print the string retryWhen to prove that the callable is called just once even when there are multiple retries. As you can see, we have made variable I equals to 3, that is after 3 attempts exception is thrown. Let's run the code. As shown on the screen, we see 3 attempts. After that, we get on-error exception. Let's have a look at another code example. What's interesting about this code is that it doesn't need to end with the error at all. We could use notification OBS to signal onComplete instead. In contrast to the previous example, we're not rethrowing the exception. Take operator reemits only set of numbers that arrive to the operator first, and then notification OBS signal onComplete. Run the command to get the output. As you can see, we're just emitting onComplete. This might be useful in situations where even multiple failed retries don't necessarily mean an error state. The operator catchError also handles only error signals. When it receives an on-error, it calls a callable that returns an observable, which is then used to continue the observable sequence instead of the source observable. Let's take a look at catchError code example. If the value is equal to 3, then exception is thrown on-error signal. This on-error signal is captured by catchError function, and instead of ending the entire observable sequence, it continues with a single value that is 42, thanks to observable just function, and then ends with onComplete. Run the command to get the output. As you can see, we have successfully obtained the output.